this photo that we use a lot, so this could be seen as what that fully repaired inset floodplain may look like in the future. Anyway, we're going to transition from lotic systems to lentic systems. And if you haven't heard that term before, lentic systems are standing water habitats such as lakes, ponds, seeps, bogs, and meadows. So that idea of lumping seeps or springs and meadows into that is sort of a Western view of this word. As far as I've been able to tell, lentic and lotic were sort of defined either sort of in the European view of things or in the Northeastern American view of things, where there's much more water available much more frequently. So they either have streams or they have lakes or bogs, and the differentiation between lentic and lotic is much more clear. In the western United States, where water availability is quite a bit different, this idea of lentic is a bit more blurred. And like I said, where we've got springs coming out of hillsides creating a spring brook, that idea of where the lentic starts and ends and where the lotic starts and ends can be a little bit of a head scratcher. But you'll kind of figure out over time the characteristics of lentic sites and the characteristics of lotic sites that could cause them to be at risk. And depending on what your risk factors are, that's what I would say to use as the judgment as to whether you would use a lentic assessment or a lotic assessment. There's also the option of kind of doing both or a blend of the two. Just always make sure that if you're going to do something like that, or if it was a bit of a head scratcher, write down the questions that you had and then write down the rationale for why you went with a lotic assessment or a lentic assessment. And that's just going to help teams in the future to figure out what you were looking at and that, that the site hasn't actually changed. So here we'll start with the definition of lentic PFC. It's very similar in structure to the lotic definition, but we've got some different variables. So lentic riparian wetland areas function properly when adequate vegetation, landform, or large woody debris is present to dissipate energies associated with wind action, wave action, and overland flow from adjacent sites, thereby reducing erosion and water quality. So instead of channelized flow that we've got through the lotic sites, now we're looking at wind, wave, and overland flow. Not all lentic sites are going to have wave action, but this was written so that it could be broad and flexible enough that if you had a lake or a pond, you could use the lentic assessment, or if you had a meadow or a spring, you could use the lentic assessment as well. So again, it's performing your PFC assessment based on potential. So looking at whether or not your site would be subject to overland flow or wave action, and then moving on from there. And then at PFC, we also filter sediment and aid floodplain development. We improve floodwater retention and groundwater recharge, develop root masses that stabilize islands and shoreline features against cutting action. So that underlined part there, instead of stream banks, we're looking at islands and shoreline features. Again, we may not have those in the case of a spring or a meadow, so we don't use that if that's not possible at potential. Restrict water percolation. So we're looking at, a lot of these sites are really dependent on having an amount of water stay at or near or just above the surface for some amount of time, and we want to make sure that whatever underground features are causing that to happen, or whatever hydrologic input features are causing that to happen, that we're not impacting that. And then at PFC, we develop diverse ponding characteristics to provide the habitat and the water depth, duration, and temperature necessary for fish production, waterfowl breeding, and other uses. Again, if a site isn't likely or historically didn't have fish, we're not going to say it's not functioning if it doesn't have fish now. It may be fully where it needs to be, it just doesn't need to have fish there. And then that idea that in general we're trying to support a greater biodiversity based on the availability of the site. So the approach here is to base the assessment on potential, which I've been talking about, and capability. So potential and capability are an old pair of terms that are still in the lentic handbook, but they are no longer in the lotic handbook. Potential is sort of what the site could be at its best without any sort of political, financial, time restrictions. So what's the best and brightest you could ever think of seeing it, or conversely, what do you think it was at a pristine state before it was degraded? And then capability is that what we kind of now call altered potential. So what's the best it could be under current circumstances based on human limitations? So we talked about, if a site doesn't have potential for something, so if we don't have standing water, then wave energy is an issue. If we don't have standing water, then shorelines aren't an issue, so we don't use those criteria. Okay, so getting into the attributes and processes, right? So this is, again, just sort of a crash course in the types of things that help control what causes wetlands or lentic areas to be where they are and to be the types of lentic areas that they are and to exist at the extent that they do. So groundwater recharge and discharge. So where's the water coming from? Is it water that's coming up from underground? Is it water that's coming in directly as rain or snow, or is it water that's coming in during floods, overbank flows from adjacent streams? What's the flood modification of the site? So that can kind of be on either side of the coin. How does that site modify flood flows by holding water back? Or if the site is created by a human structure, that flood modification that we've created may then produce a lentic site. The inundation, so how often is water there on top of the surface? How long is it there? And then is it once a year? Is it every time it rains? Is it once every couple of years? And then what's holding the water up there? So the term aquatard in sedimentology or stratigraphy is a layer underground that only allows water to flow through slowly. So it's kind of a break there as water tries to flow downward. It doesn't let it, so it holds that water up. The extreme version of that would be an aquaclude, where think of a completely solid layer of clay or a layer of shale, where water hits that and just doesn't move through virtually at all. So how is that affecting the ability of water to kind of stay there and be available for your site? And then shoreline shape. So if you do have standing water, what's the shape of that shoreline over time? But then also, how does the shape of that shoreline in regard to slope as you're moving from upland into the water, how does that impact the type of habitats that you're going to see transition from upland into aquatic? So here's just a quick example of that idea of an aquatard or an aquaclude. So in that top photo, state A, we've got sort of that pink layer down through there. In this example, it's permafrost, so we've got frozen soil down through there that acts as a barrier to water. Water's not allowed to flow down through it under gravity. Say if someone went in and said, hey, I like this pond, but I'd like it to be a little bigger. They go in with the excavator, they dig it wider, but they also dig it deeper, and if they punch through that aquatard or that aquaclude, you're basically pulling the plug on the bathtub and you lose your ability to retain that water. But then moving on to the vegetation side of the stool, again, very similar to the LODEX site, so community types and distribution, and that's spatially and over time. What's the density and cover, and that's related to reproduction, survival rates, disturbance, things like that, getting into that whole idea of community dynamics and succession. What are the rooting characteristics? So again, do we have those wetland plants that we want that have those deep, strong roots to help keep soil in place? And is everything kind of working in unison to help ensure that those plants are surviving past the germination stage? Moving on to the soil leg of the stool, again, very similar soil type. Is it porous or fine? How did it get there? Is it depositional? Is it alluvial, colluvial, that sort of thing? Distribution of aerobic and anaerobic soils. This is really important when you're doing PFC on a lentic site, and can be just as important on some of the LODEX sites too. But if you've got a soil scientist with you to help figure out what the potential of the site is in regard to extent, how big would that meadow have been historically, you can go out and dig some soil pits and look for where those wetland soils were historically. So even though they're dry now, that history can be preserved for a while, and your soil scientists can help pick that out. So where are they now? Where were they historically? What's the annual pattern of soil water states? So are they wet year-round? Are they wet for a month out of the year? How do they get wet? Are they saturated from underground only? Are they saturated by overland flows? Are they saturated from a spring? So it's sort of underground for a while, but then once that spring brook starts, then stuff's saturated by surface water. And then again, how frequently does that happen? How long does the water stay there? And what's the restrictive material? Is it bedrock underneath? Is it permafrost? Is it a layer of clay? What's causing your water to stay up near the surface? And then erosion and deposition isn't as big of a issue with some of the lentic sites as it may seem with lotic sites. But deposition can be a big thing. If the rate of deposition or sediment being transported to your site has changed from the surrounding areas, you may get that, if you have standing water, you may get that standing water filling in and changing from an aquatic site to more of a wetland or riparian site faster if you've got some disturbances. And then what do those depositional features look like? Do you have, you know, a giant sort of a delta forming where you don't think you would have had that under natural conditions? Or is that part of what the site just looks like based on the surrounding area? We do include sort of water quality in the description of attributes and processes here. It can be a little more influential in some of these, especially when you look, as this picture shows, a hot spring here, so we've got a lot of thermal activity throughout Nevada. So the temperature is going to be very high. Dissolved solids is going to be very high. Dissolved oxygen can be fairly low. That's going to change the type of vegetation that you can have around there. And again, just because you don't have the classic wetland vegetation doesn't mean that the site isn't functioning properly. It's just based on the natural conditions there. And then the biotic community kind of takes all of that into account. So aquatic plants in the actual water, transitioning into the riparian plants, transitioning into the upland plants, what's the recruitment and reproduction of all of those, and then nutrient use, and then associated with that nutrient cycling. So do you have sort of an exaggerated rate of eutrophication of an open water system, or is it just part of what that natural succession would be? And then structures. Again, this is something we don't look at as much with lotic sites, because by the time we get structures in there, we're considering an altered site. But some of our wetlands may occur because of structures put in by humans. So here's an example of an impoundment, likely for stock water, but on the one edge of that, you see what's probably a cattail marsh or a hard-stem bulrush or something like that growing in there. So we've created this artificial wetland, but just because it's artificial doesn't mean that it's providing some function and providing some habitat and some wildlife values and things like that. So that then becomes a question that if we want to maintain that, then we need to look at the stability of the structure that's creating that.